and Reconciliation Commissions were established to deal with the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars rather than the ICTY. Representing the proposition, we have the team from Zimbabwe, and on the opposition, we have the team from France. From the proposition side, our speakers are first speaker, Dean, second speaker, third speaker, Leslie, and during the reply, Dean. On the opposition side, our speakers are first speaker, Frank, second speaker, Matthew, third speaker, Sarah, reply speech, Matthew. Each speaker has 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The first and last minute of each speech is considered protected time, during which points of information, or POIs, may not be offered. The judges will signal the end of protected time at the 1 minute mark, after which POIs can be offered, and will signal the return of protected time at the 7 minute mark. At the 8 minute mark, they will give you a double clap or ding at the end of the speech. Additionally, there will be 3 claps or dings at 8:15, and the judges will stop listening at 8:30. Best of luck to both teams, and now I hand the floor to the chair.
So I will try and time and make all the relevant sounds, but if you're busy taking notes, you might forget to make noise. Okay, well, for some of the app, so that'll be fine. Great. Well, if there's no questions about the rules or the question, I'd like to invite the first speaker of the proposition to take the floor. Okay.
Okay, just was setting up my papers. Cool. So I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Even now, the generational torment that bleeds violently through the souls of Bosnia and Croatia has found no resolve. We say at the stage at which the claimed lives of the 140,000 victims still cry and Yugoslavia weeps, the ICTY, a body that lives deep in the abyss of poison justice, remains in control of determining that very justice. Proposition supports a TRC in its place. I will contend on 2 key respects. Firstly, on the lack of inclusion in producing an ineffective remedy. Secondly, on the sacrifice of an essential change for retribution. My second speaker will extend on how the ICTY was limited by jurisdiction. But before we get into that, 3 things to note on context. 1, we say that the war in Yugoslavia was mainly an outcome of the existing economic and ethnic tensions. Ultimately, we say it broke up into 4 key impacts. 1, we say the breakup of Yugoslavia, which saw vast immigrations of former Yugoslavs into their republic of origins, into post-Yugoslav republics with which they felt safe. But secondly, the refugee crisis for the people stuck in countries they did not identify with. We say those scattered across Europe, many of them have not been able to return back to their homeland from which they came from. But thirdly, we say that long-term seeded ethnic divide and hatred still exists to this day. And lastly, we say that there's economic destruction and political uncertainty that exists. Second point on setup is to say that it was indeed necessary for the tribunal to address these problems, though it didn't. How do we define the ICTY on our end? Purely, we say it was a vengeful tribunal that was mildly concerned with redressing the harm to victims and put punishment of war criminals at its center. Note these defining characteristics. 1, we say that the tribunal's jurisdiction narrowly covered crimes that happened in the former Yugoslavian territory after 1991. The problem was far beyond that scope. Note the violent crackdowns on nationalist movements in Kosovo, Croatia, and Slovenia in the 1980s. If OP is sincere to bringing criminals to justice, they have to account for the 100s of criminals
who evaded the law due to lack of territorial presence. But secondly, we say it was laden with bureaucratic structures that developed the remedy and rendered it inaccessible. But lastly, we say it was an illegal, biased court that set itself to push for the UN interests. We knew it for disproportionately persecuting Serb defendants whilst being more lenient towards Croat and Bosniak suspects. We say that's something that is important. Why then won't people likely use this, particularly as a platform to defend their innocence? We think that's something that is important on its own. But before we move into that, we need to clarify the beauty or conceptualize the world in which the beauty of a world in which we set TRCs. One, we say that we achieve and spread a more reliable truth through one, establishing conclusive reports involving gathering testimonies from both perpetrators and victims and ensuring inclusive process for the victims. But secondly, we say we provide amnesty for full confessions that promotes transparency and accountability. We say that there's going to be dialogue facilitation, creating spaces for former adversaries to engage and to foster mutual understanding and respect for each other. But thirdly, we say that there are going to be victim-centered remedies and solutions. This looks like suggesting legal, institutional, and policy reforms. This could include changes in laws, restructuring the security forces, or the reforms in the judiciary in itself. What does this look like? It looks like institution building. It looks like advising on the establishment or strengthening the institutions that promote human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. We say it looks like support services. We say it looks like providing psychological and legal support to victims during the process. But then why, on the counter, do we then not think they're going to use this as a platform for them to defend their innocence? We say in the best case, we say people will likely use this as a platform to air out their concerns. We think they're going to air out the truthful concerns because they've got no harm of being incarcerated. But secondly, we say even in the instance that this is likely, we say we get a marginal benefit in the instance that we're getting more testimonies compared to none that are truthful at all. We think the willingness to accept, we're also willing to give amnesty to specific participants. We don't think that this is going to be blanket amnesty, but we think we're going to provide for those that haven't committed very large war crimes, right? But we say there's going to be a provision for reparation for the people who've been proven to be harmed. We think in the past this has looked like psychosocial support, group therapy, economic and educational empowerment. Now we're going to move firstly on how tribunals' lack of involvement meant an ineffective remedy. But before I do that, I'll take your P1.
When the most important war criminals have committed genocide are granted full amnesty because they cooperate, how are the victims who've lost dozens of family members going to feel?
Panel, if they were listening to any of our setup, we've already told you that people who commit large crimes are likely not going to get amnesty. We say we look at it depending on the type of criminal that you met. But we're going to show you why we perform much better anyway on our side. We say firstly on how tribunals lack inclusion meant an ineffective remedy. We say it should not be forgotten that the ICTY was based in The Hague from the Balkans, far away from the Balkans where the atrocities occurred. The effects of this were multiple-fold. One, we say that the victims and the witnesses' denial of access. We think a huge crop of victims from Bosnia and Croatia and Serbia were shut out by the logistical and financial challenges going to the tribunal. We think their testimonial piece in that instance was never heard. But secondly, we say that this geographical distance contributed to a sense of disconnection between the tribunal and the affected population. The ICTY thus became viewed as an illegitimate external body imposing justice rather than a process that involved and understood the local context and experience. But consider a world in which the TRC would have been used, right? We think it guaranteed a sense of involvement and acknowledgement for the victims. We enjoyed this involvement at Sierra Leone. We enjoyed this involvement at the post-apartheid TRC of South Africa. We enjoyed this involvement when it included all the Ogoni tribes in South Korea, in Canada, and so on, right? So then we think, lastly, we say that the distant tribunal realistically couldn't possess nuanced understanding of local customs, languages, and social dynamics with which were crucial for delivering context-sensitive justice. We say some ethnic Croatian tribes, for example, were displaced during the wars and to date have not been returned to their ancestral lands. What is the impact of this? We say, one, that reconciliation efforts were indeed impeded as there was a disregard for the ICTY judgments, regardless of fairness, due to the entrenched skepticism that existed, limiting that mutual understanding. So we think there are existing tensions, regardless of the resolve that exists, that are political and that are cultural, and we never, and you see people in Croatia not being able to stand the Serbians at the end of the day. There's a hate that could potentially spark conflict in another war. We think the conflict and the existing vitriol that exists around it. How are we going to weigh this? Weigh this reconciliation versus legal justice, right? There's an extended harm here. We think people are angry and they carry vitriol in their heart. We think what we do on our side is we provide them solace in providing them this mutual understanding of what is going on on their ends. We say on their side, they find a very skewed version of social justice that is not only going to help them, but even in the case in which that social justice is true, we tell you that it's likely not going to, we tell you that it provides no closure. But in the instance in which it is true, we tell you in that it only solves the tensions in that exact moment. It doesn't deal with the extended harms that exist before the war and after the war and all the tensions that these particular people have. The last argument is on the sacrifice of an essential change for retribution. The premise here is to say, although it had its successes, the ICTY propagated and reinforced instances of ethnic segregation and violence as it became a very divisive process for all involved, with tensions still extending to animosity between the Serbs and the Bosnians in a football match as recently as 2019. We think it inhibited the ability for there to be a just after war in the Yugoslavia conflict. That is in three regards. One, we say hundreds of thousands of people are still living in displaced persons in a different country due to lack of reconciliation. Secondly, we say that they were defending accounts of what occurred, which sparked tensions surrounding the war memorials and the commemorations in itself. But thirdly, we say that the individuals who testified were seen as traitors. They restricted them from accessing support which they needed to heal both professionally and locally. The TRC on our side, however, is locally based, so the testimonials you get to cooperate with local individuals. But secondly, we say more individuals are reserved and you don't use nearly as much resources. We then use these resources in things like generally just helping people in psychosocial support. Principally support this because it's important for people to feel involved in what they're doing, to feel involved in the reconciliation process and achieving reconciliation in itself. We think we deal with the depth of the harm at the end of the day. We deal with the idea of having that long-term beneficiary at the end of the day. With this, never have I ever been more proud.
Right, thanks for the first speaker. I invite the first speaker to take the floor. Just a small note, do remember to give a clear wise to the set.
Okay.
All right, my time will start on my first word. There is one thing that opposition hates on PropSci's case, which is injustice. What they fight for is an idealized world. They think that 6 republics that are ethnically tensioned can work together, can cooperate, and have a centralized government. This is completely unrealistic, so proud to oppose. In my speech, I'll bring forth a few rebuttals, some framing, and then I'll dive into my first substantive argument. First thing they bring us is that there are not many criminals that are actually incarcerated. There's one response for this. There's a sort of trickle-down effect because, as a matter of fact, they indicted 161 of the most important high generals. What are the impacts of this? Who are the people that actually orchestrate and command these genocides, these high generals? If we incarcerate them, these genocides would never be organized in the first place. Second of all, and it's absolutely impossible and unrealistic to prosecute absolutely everyone. You have to put a face on the crime, you have to put a face on the people that are organizing these crimes, and that is exactly what our side is doing. Second of all, they talk about how they convicted more Serbs. However, not only is this not true, this is simply just because they have committed more crimes. They have convicted, actually, as a matter of fact, almost proportionally as many Croat high generals, which have committed a lot of crimes. Third thing they bring us is about how it's centralized in The Hague. And this is exactly why the ICTY is better, right? It has no bias, right? On their side, what they have on their model, they think that there can be a TRC in every single government, that they can work together on their domestic courts that have actually no judicial system. They think that these domestic courts, as a matter of fact, will look like Serbs prosecuting Serbs, which is very unrealistic because the politics strive on this divisive rhetoric. They strive on nationalism. It is completely unrealistic for their side to happen. Now on some points of framing. there are a few crucial differences between the ICTY and the TRC. Number one, the ICTY can actually act while the crime is happening. This is crucial not only to find evidence, but also to act as a deterrent. Second of all, the ICTY can actually bring tangible change. TRCs are not judicial bodies. All they can do is suggest. And as a matter of fact, what incentive do corrupt governments have to actually accept these suggestions when all this is going to do is deter themselves? And third of all, the TRC's focus is on finding the truth, while the ICTY focuses on actually bringing justice, on actually bringing accountability, and I'll explain to you why this is the most crucial. Moreover, TRCs are extremely specific to Yugoslavia, and the reason why is because it is contingent on the cooperation of 6 republics that have extreme ethnic tensions. So why do we believe that TRCs are genuinely ineffective? Well, simply because there's way less pressure for states to cooperate. For ICTY, the international law is extremely important for Western states that actually want to create precedents, right? And this simply does not happen for TRCs, where on the other hand, there's a way smaller role for these international communities in this proceeding that leads to people actually generally caring less. And this means that in a lot of countries, TRCs probably wouldn't even happen, or it wouldn't include all the most important actors. As I've explained, they have absolutely no incentive to do so. Now I'm going to dive into my 2 substantive arguments. The first one, which is going to be how we're going to bring justice to these victims and explaining why they're the most important actor in this motion. And second of all, we're going to be talking about how the ICTY created an international precedent and set the stage for many more international tribunals. So first of all, why are victims the most important actor in this motion? Very simple. They were the ones that are the most impacted by the war. They live with the grief of losing their loved ones, waking up every morning alone and seeing their pictures, commemorating them every year and remembering what happened to them. This is everyday trauma that restricts their ability to move forward. They lose their mental health, they lose their dignity, they lose their agency. Now, why is justice important to these victims? Very simple. Ever since we're little, the idea of punishment is ingrained in us as a social norm. As a child, when you do something wrong, you expect your parents to punish you, right? And so this lack of punishment in the ICTY means that victims feel as if their pain has not been recognized. You feel like you have no value, and this will linger in their mind. Not only a feeling of grief, but a feeling of anger, a need for revenge. Second of all, it's very important that the international community recognizes the wrongdoings. When the international community sees you and validates you, you feel as if you are in the right, as if others feel the anger that you feel, you can relate to them. You feel supported and liberated because the power of condemnation towards the perpetrators of the crime is bigger. And note, this is very important. The process of testimonies at ICTY is crucial. You finally feel as if you have the power over the war criminals. They sit in the chair while the entire room describes and explains why they're in the wrong, why they're horrible and evil human beings. You feel the power over them because you know that when you testify, your testimony will put them in prison, and your pain and suffering finally feels like it is enough to acknowledge your pain. And beyond recognition, it's also important for the victims to know that the war criminals are behind bars and that they are suffering. The way in which criminal sentencing works allows victims foreclosure. Because you want revenge against them, you want them to feel pain, and you want them to rot behind bars. Seeing their defeated faces while they listen to testimonies and when they are sentenced is a cathartic moment. And finally, it is important for these victims that they are removed from the public life. When these people are behind bars, the public forgets about them. Fine, they may be talking about them in the beginning, but ultimately you're going to forget. And they're no longer able to go on TV shows, the news, and tell their side of the story. They ultimately lose their platform. Now, on the comparative, what happens is you see photos of them hanging around with political elites without the country, which is a horrible reminder for you that they still have power. Their life is still normal, while yours will never be the same. Now, what is the comparative of this entire argument? TRCs do a couple of things that don't allow victims to feel justice ever. For starters, they never get to see the person murdering their family, murdering their loved ones, that sexually assaulted them behind bars. You also are not testifying against them, which is crucial. In a TRC, you have to confront the assailant face to face, and not only is this traumatic, but victims are also confronting far more powerful people that are experiencing rhetoric and riling people up. It becomes completely unclear who is guilty, who is the bad guy. You are put on the same stand, you are put on the same pedestal, you have the same time to talk. You are treated equally, which signals that there is clearly no wrong guy, which invalidates the victim's trauma. I'll take a POI if there's any. Well, as I've just mechanized right now, when you're, as a child, you feel this sense that when you don't think that someone is punished, they have not done any wrongdoing. I've mechanized entirely now how when the international community recognizes your wrongdoings, you feel a satisfaction. And finally, why were victims owed justice? Two main things. Victims were limited by the international community in their capacity to exercise self-defense. NATO stopping Croatia's liberation operations for years and waiting for something horrible, for a genocide to happen, to allow it, or stopping arms trades to Croatia, which were crucial for self-defense. And this obviously means that now the international community has the duty towards victims to bring them back to the state that they were before, which means restoring their dignity and bringing them justice. All in all, side proposition is living in an ideal world where they really think that 6 republics that absolutely hate each other can create an alliance. Moreover, as I've mechanized in 3 main ways, there's no way they can actually prosecute these people. This looks like domestic people. This looks like domestic incarcerations, right? For example, as I said, Serbia prosecuting Serbia. There's no incentive for the government to implement this law since they are corrupt. So proud to oppose.
Can the panel confirm that you can hear me if I speak like this?
Yeah.
Right. I'll be beginning my speech in the reverse count of 3, 2, 1. The ICTY, once held as a bastion of righteousness, became a controversial entity shrouded in the shadows of illegitimacy. We think it was a court that was meant to heal the wounds of a fractured nation, but instead, it sowed the seeds of hate and mistrust and doubt within these ethnic groups that we think needed redress, and we wouldn't have ever placed our trust in this biased court. What are the 2 things that you're going to get from this speech? 1, I'm going to give you the strategic flaws that side opposition makes in this debate that don't give them access to the type of benefits or impacts that they think are feasible. But secondly, I'm going to give you an extension about why we think that the limitations of the jurisdiction of the ICTY are particularly the reason why you still have the ethnic tensions and the unresolved victim closure that we think these people deserve. So what are the strategic flaws that you get from side proposition? 2 things. First, they tell us that victims get the greatest amount of closure when they see that their oppressors are behind bars. There are 2 responses to this argument. First, we don't think in the vast majority of instances those individuals that oppressed these ethnic minorities actually went behind bars. We think out of hundreds of thousands of individuals that were harmed, that were killed by the genocides in Kosovo, we think only 161 people out of all of the 6 states were actually indicted. We think that a vast majority of individuals that particularly committed these crimes didn't even make it behind bars. We think that those individuals never got that type of closure that they think these individuals have access to. 2, we think that those individuals that wanted the closure didn't even get that closure to begin with. This is to say that leaders or high-ranking officials like Milos Slometić from Serbia actually died before they were actually indicted, actually died before they were actually sent to be incarcerated for the crimes that they committed. We think the ICTY operated for over 20 years, and we think in that period of over 20 years was a period where individuals that existed within those genocides didn't get the redress that we think they deserved, right? So we think in the vast majority of instances, individuals didn't feel like they got the redress that they deserved. But secondly, we say that when they tell us that confronting individuals within these TRCs is something that becomes traumatic, What do you think is something that's a strategic flaw on their side? Because in the ICTY, testimonies are still required. To think that these victims are still required to appear before courts and testify against individuals that are defending their innocence. In the vast majority of instances, even their ability to defend themselves accurately was even made more difficult because the official language of like the ICTY was English and French, where they had to go through interpreters for them to be able to get that redress. We think this is something that becomes marginally better when they exist within TRCs that are likely to incorporate the languages that these people speak. We think they are likely to be less traumatic when they actually go to TRCs as opposed to when they actually go to the ICTY. We think this is something that they needed to consider. But then what are the few clashes that we think they particularly don't win on within this debate? Firstly, is on the clash of who better provides closure for victims post-Yugoslav wars, right? What do they tell us? They tell us that victims prioritize more than just getting like redress for displacement that happened during the wars that existed. We say this is untrue for two reasons. First, we think that those individuals needed that redress. For example, the reason why the Serbs currently are not in good terms with Croatians and so on is because they particularly feel like they didn't get the justice that was owed to them by the ICTY, right? Because we think that even in the instances where indicted were made, because of that jurisdiction of like limitations between the language structures of like the ICTY and also the legal text that the ICTY was using to mediate like the trials, we think that those individuals don't even understand why even individuals that were acquitted by the court were particularly acquitted. What this means is that even if the ICTY did do right in like indicting and acquitting individuals, the mere fact that individuals on the ground don't perceive its decision as something that was particularly right, we think that those individuals don't get the satisfaction or redress that we think that they want, that we think that they say that these individuals get. I'll take you.
Can you characterize how the victims are going to feel when they know that the killers are out roaming on the street because of amnesty?
We think individuals feel like this already. We think 161 people out of 100,000 people that were harmed through genocide is something that doesn't make sense. You can't say that 161 people particularly committed a whole genocide. We think that's a strategic flaw on your side. But secondly, those individuals that were indicted, a vast majority of them were acquitted anyways, so we don't think that those individuals got the closure that they needed. We think this is something that you needed to contend with within your whole case. But then what do we think is particularly important in like providing that victim closure? One, we say that these individuals that were particularly displaced post-Yugoslav needed to be returned to their homelands, right? We say that we think my first speaker already gives you characterization about why individuals are still displaced to this day and that they don't really have their rights being meaningfully represented within governments because of such displacement, right? We say that the Serb minority within like Kosovo still feels like individuals or their rights are not being well represented because of the ethnic tensions that the Albanian majority within that state is still feeling because of like the lack of redress through like Tito's rule and how Serbs were forced to migrate to that area, right? We think this is something that ICTY ignored, and we think this continues to exacerbate already existing tensions, right? Why is it important for these existing tensions to be gotten rid of? Two reasons. One, I think my first speaker already gives you an analysis about why there is a likelihood that individuals are likely to get into violent conflict again, right? This is to say that if you have even football matches leading to acts of violence where individuals actively throw stones at each other over football matches, we think that this continued ethnic tension is what led to the Yugoslav wars to begin with. We think when economic factors were actually the reason why Yugoslavia was failing, we think that individuals and that nationalist rhetoric co-opted such economic issues and made them more about ethnic divide. We think this is something that is more likely to happen on their side. Because we think that the ICTY particularly just focuses on which crimes were committed and how best we punish these individuals. It doesn't really interrogate about the ethnic tensions that exist on the ground or the cultural context that exists within these communities. I think the understanding of this cultural context is important so as to resolve the ethnic tensions that these individuals have towards each other, because this is what leads to ongoing acts of violence against these groups. But then what's my extension within this debate? We think my extension is going to prove to you two things. First, about why we think that even in the best case that the ICTY was instantiated, we still think that it wasn't able to truly address the issues that it meant to address. What are the mechanisms for this? We think there are twofold. One, we say that the mere fact that the ICTY was located in The Hague, away from the Balkans, meant that individuals within the Balkans had limited access to go and give their testimonies. The reason why this becomes marginally better with TRCs is that they can be located within each individual state, where Albanian majorities and Serb minorities within countries like Kosovo can actively engage within conversation. We think this confrontation is necessary so that these individuals can actively air out their grievances against these communities. Why do you think this is likely to work? We have seen this happen in countries like Rwanda, where the Gacaca courts that actually indicted over 1 million people within 4 years, over the 20 years where they indicted 161 people by the ICTY. I think that you have more effectivity in terms of the turnout of the numbers that people come to give these testimonies. 2, we say that you are able to resolve those ethnic tensions. Because we think that the reason why individuals continue to hate each other in status quo is that they feel like the ICTY was an external body that didn't allow them to actively air out their grievances. Because one, that location within the Hague limits their ability to go there, but also the language barriers that exist within such instances limit them. But thirdly, we say that the indictment of a Serb majority already makes the Serb community feel like the court itself is unjust. This is to say that even if in the best case that ICTY indicted people, the mere fact that those individuals view it as an illegitimate court makes it even worse on their side, because we think that the ICTY sows seeds of like mistrust and doubt within these communities. Proud.
Thank the second top speaker. I invite the second opposition speaker to address the House.
Panel, side proposition today had a burden not only to show why ICTI did not work, but also to show why they would achieve comparative advantages on TRC. Unfortunately, what they've done today is simply criticize the ICTY and portray an idealized version of TRC, asserting effects without linking their impacts, without showing how this would crucially happen. Let's start with some mischaracterizations on their side of TRC. First of all, they talk about the massive advantages on testimony, yet they have a deep contradiction in their case. They say they will give amnesty, and that's why they have testimony, yet they say that for the most important war criminals, these people won't have amnesty. Therefore, they will have no incentive to give testimony, because their crucial incentive is to have amnesty in order to admit the war crimes. Therefore, their advantage on testimony does not stand. Furthermore, they talk about much less involvement by local testimony, yet thousands of people testified in the ICTY. There were thousands of victims that were able to speak their truth on our side. Furthermore, their characterization of TRC is quite idealized. The cooperation between 6 states that have been fighting a deadly war with thousands of deaths, with heinous crimes, with a rhetoric of hate that's deeply embedded in their population and education, completely forbids their impact. They simply assert that they will achieve cooperation and peace in the long term. We do not understand how this is rooted in reality. But let's move on to the arguments that they have tried to bring today, starting with the lack of inclusion and the distance because the ICTY was located in The Hague. It's precisely because of these ethnic tensions that we talked before that it had to be located in The Hague, and why the TRCs wouldn't have worked because there were too many tensions for cooperation in the local area. But also their main assertion is that it was biased because in The Hague and that there wasn't local engagement. First of all, because it was international, there was less bias than if it were domestic courts, their alternative, because these domestic courts, I would say in our first speech, have clearly no incentive to prosecute their own populations because they have emotional bias, not rational decisions that are made. And when you have just fought a war, when you hate so much the other countries, you are not going to prosecute your own population, who you perceive to have fought for yourself, not to commit war crimes. And finally, as I said, in framing, there were thousands and thousands of testimonies. There was inclusion, and they were filmed on television. People could see them. It wasn't that distant. People participated. People saw the testimonies. Their second argument was on the chances for retribution and how they tried to construct a better world on their side. They mostly, in this argument, criticized the ICTY, saying there was ethnic segregation, displaced people, and people testified were seen as traitors, but they did not mechanize how the TRC would solve any of these problems, just saying how it was bad on our side, therefore they cannot bring any positive material. But we assert that first of all, it's symmetric on both sides at their best, because as I said previously, after a loss in a war, you seek a culprit, you're very heinous towards the other side, you're not seeking retribution, so it's very hard to achieve retribution and cooperation between countries, but also without justice, without seeing criminals punished on all sides, as you said, generals from all sides being prosecuted and convicted, you will yourself seek retribution. You will seek to hate the others and to bring justice because you have not heard justice. Finally, they tried to counter arguments about victims by saying, first of all, that not enough people were convicted. We have repeated multiple times that the most important leaders were convicted, and we have shown how this is the most important, because from the victim's perspective, the people they see on television, the people saying the hate speech, the presidents, the leaders, the generals ordering the massacres of their family, those are the people towards they have hate. They don't know the names of the soldiers who killed them, who received orders, who weren't leading the heinous massacres. They want the generals, the presidents to go to prison. That is what happened. The president of the Serbian region of Bosnia and Herzegovina went to prison. The high generals from Serbia, from Croatia went to prison for their war crimes. That is what the victims want to see. No response on their side, on the perspective of the victims, and on the human side that they feel. Except for the point that they talk about the language barrier of the ICTY. Obviously a very weak argument. There was translation. They could speak their side. And on the traumatic side, they say that, our argument that people weren't on an equal level in the TRC isn't true. Obviously, if you see the person who's committed war crimes on the side of a convicted person not getting amnesty, you're going to feel much better because you know that they're the ones being tried, not you. You're not on an equal stance. We're moving on to our second substantive argument about the international and legal precedents and deterrence created by the ICTY. Now, why were their precedents established? First of all, because of inspiration and test run for establishment of other international criminal courts. For instance, the special tribunals in Sierra Leone, Cambodia, and Rwanda, who are widely considered to be very successful and convicted dozens and dozens of war criminals. Note that even where the TRC was not efficient, as they said, because it was novel enough or underfunded, courts that followed learned from these mistakes and did better for their victims. And also because it defined new types of crimes and normalized this punishment. The ICTY case law recognized rape, sexual slavery, forced sterilization, and pregnancy as codified war crimes and crimes against humanity for the first time, and expanding them to male and females. These crimes were rampant before Yugoslavia. For instance, World War II, millions and millions of women were raped, but they were never recognized. And it's the ICTY that recognized these crimes, make it impossible for victims throughout the world to not be silent and uncompensated, but to achieve justice. Why have these developments been preserved in international law? Why have they established precedents? First of all, because convictions at the ICTY cross a new legal threshold in decision making, showing it's both possible and right to prosecute these crimes. Because there's a crucial effect in legal doctrine called the watershed effect, in which legal decision making, because lawyers respect precedents, because of jurisprudence, which is the basis for common law, and international law, which is strictly based on precedent, when there's a new decision that is made, it tends to be kept as precedent in international law. And also because the UN and Western powers, like the EU and United States, were central to establishing the ICTY, and they're generally the top watchdogs for human rights in war times. So the advancement of international law and legal systems are useful to them, and they're going to push them with their scope and power throughout the world. Now, what are the impacts of these? They're threefold, and they're crucial. First of all, the victims of sexual violence were given recognition for the first time. These are tens of thousands of victims of wartime rape globally. The scope of this impact is absolutely massive. Even if a TRC was in Yugoslavia, it would likely not investigate wartime rape because TRC did not have the legal ability to establish precedent. Therefore, they would have no power to recognize rape as a crime. They would have none of these impacts, which are massive throughout the world. But also because the foundation of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which was directly based on the ICTY, allowed for the conviction of individual criminals from countries that do not have their own tribunals and wouldn't have allowed for TRCs. There are countries that don't have their judicial systems, but where war criminals have killed thousands, have committed genocides, have raped young girls and women, which would have no punishment without the ICTY, which established precedent. This is why our comparative is so much stronger, not only in Yugoslavia, but throughout the world. And finally, because the ICTY and its spin-off course and cases created a world-recognized and firm way of scrutinizing war crimes. Because these courts deter warring countries from committing terrible atrocities because they're scared of getting prosecuted or losing international support, because the ICTY showed that an iron fist would be held down on the most important actors of war crimes. These are the people who make the decisions in these war crimes. These are people who see for the first time that they could go behind bars, that they would not act in impunity when they killed thousands, when they raped hundreds and thousands of women. And also because when countries fail to abide by the international law and get accused of war crimes, it forces their allies in the international community to stop supporting them. This is because if you're an EU country or the United States and supporting war crimes or human rights, or supporting human rights, your citizens are going to oppose your support for genocide or war crimes. And the way this applies very concretely, for instance, was when Serbia started ethnically cleansing Kosovo in 1998, the majority of the world felt compelled to recognize Kosovo and support NATO wrongs of Serbia to stop these atrocities. And also, even today, when Israel is killing thousands of Gazans, what someone have called a genocide, the only reason why the fiercest ally of Israel, the United States, is calling them out and threatening to stop sending weapons is because the ICJ directly commended Israel and its leader, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who makes the decision, again, the importance of condemning leaders of only 161 people, but the most important 161 people. It shows that they cannot just stand by their side anymore, that they ask Israel to stop killing civilians. The impacts of the ICTY are immense throughout the world. Better world for Yugoslavia, better world throughout the world, and justice for victims of war crimes throughout the world is we're extremely proud to oppose.
Back to the second opposition speaker to close the substantive case for the opposition. I invite the third opposition speaker to take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Can you please confirm if I'm audible if I speak like this?
Slightly louder. It's very echoey. Just slightly louder.
Am I audible if I speak like this? Perfect. With that being said, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Frankly, panel, would have loved a world in which the ICT had conducted itself in the way opposition tried to sold to us in this particular debate. Unfortunately, they don't want to confront the reality that this tribunal actually swayed people from what was supposed to be and turned out to be a scandalous court that harmed those it was supposed to actually protect. TRCs would have been way better, and we've already proved to you in our cases, and we're going to keep on doing this. We are still proud to propose. A couple of things then that we're going to get in this particular speech. Firstly, on the rebuttal that we get from the argument that we get from O2. Secondly, on the strategic flaws that you get on the entire side as a bench. And lastly, on the clash meta right. So what do they tell us from O2? They argue that on their side of the house, we are likely going to set, they were able to set international and legal precedents, which was then subsequently impactful in subsequent rulings and procedures. Why do we necessarily think that is untrue? Panel, we think that this precedent already exists because there are so many mechanisms that have already been put in place to actually put in place this particular form of precedence. We talk about the ICC and we talk about the ICJ. All these courts are already existent in status quo, and we believe that even in a world where the ICTY was not particularly existent, these would have been able to set a similar precedent. We don't necessarily think that this debate is about precedence whatsoever, panel, because we think even without the Yugoslav wars, international law already exists and is particularly impactful. So the entire idea about international and legal precedence is one that does not necessarily have a place in this particular debate. So what then do you tell you in terms of what they failed to do in this particular debate? 3 key strategic flaws that they had. The first one is that they come to this debate and then they tell us that they believe in that on their side, we get better victims, we get victims having a little bit more closure when this justice is administered. 2 responses here. The first one is that we think it's untrue that you actually get this form of justice on their side. Why is this particularly untrue? Because most of these rulings are already deemed to be unfair to begin with. This looks like people in Croatia already arguing that the court in itself was lenient towards the Serbs themselves. We think because people have already this entire perception that these rulings are unfair already, it means the victims in those particular regions do not necessarily feel that these rulings were fair. Hence, there is no amount of retribution that they actually get on their side. But secondly, we tell you that even if that's the case, we think this already takes a lot of time, and in most cases, it's only administered after a series of long and legal battles, right? What are the impact of these long and legal battles? We think, one, we lead to a situation where we've got 20 years and we've only been able to indict about 161 people. This is obviously not efficient, panel, and we don't necessarily think that they win this debate by trying to argue for this. But secondly, we already tell you that on our side of the house, where we are able to do this, would have been able to be more efficient and going to be more impactful towards ensuring that these victims actually get the closure that they need. Why then do we necessarily think that the second strategic flaw that they had in this debate was particularly problematic? They tell us that on their side, they are able to get a better justice than on our side. And their entire stance is basically on how they think they are able to indict the people who were at the forefront of these particular atrocities. What then do we tell you? We tell you that obviously, if this is the case, we can be able to argue for the very same thing on our side. We tell you, Dino already tells you in P1 that we do not have anything called blanket amnesty. What does this look like? We tell you that we've got individuals that we really know that they were at the forefront of these particular activities. We think these individuals will be indicted whatsoever, and they will not be able to go scot-free as they try to argue on their side. So at the end of the day, the harms that they try to perpetuate become symmetric, because we can be able to also tell you on our side side that we're going to indict those who were actually leading this particular industry. But secondly, we then give you an example of how TRCs are likely going to give better outcomes, right? We bring to you the idea of the ICTR, which was the very same thing that was done after the post-Rwandan genocide of 1994 in Rwanda. What was the benefit of the TRC be better than the ICTR in this particular regard? We think that the ICTR in Rwanda, we think that the TRC in Rwanda successfully garnered for this justice through locally initiated Gashasha courts, as you already got from our P2, right? So at best, their push for justice for major criminals exists on our side as well. And we think Gashasha courts are even more efficient because we're able to induct over 1 million people in Rwanda in a period of 4 years, as opposed to their side that are only able to indict about 161 people over a period of 20 years. We think that in itself is problematic. But lastly, on the idea of bias towards TRCs, right, where they try to argue that TRCs have got a particular bias, we don't think this is already existent on our side of the house, because what do we tell you, panel? You need to understand that on our side of the house, we've got these TRCs, we're able to have these locally initiated forums of discussion that allow everyone to actually come into place to speak about this. Realize how the TRC, the ICT was located in The Hague, which is miles and miles away from the Balkans themselves. To make it worse, the only official language that were used in this particular region were only English and French. We think that was already discriminatory in this particular regard because a majority of people from the Balkans were not able to speak like this. But before I go on further to Clash Meta, I'll take it.
Yeah, you're talking about all these indictments, but TRC is not a judicial body, so how will they indict? Moreover, we talked about the intent of the government that they're not going to...
We tell you, panel, on our side of the house that we don't necessarily think that when you have TRCs, you're not just going to let every criminal go scot-free. What this particularly looks like is that we've got individuals that are going to be referred back to the courts that they can be able to get the actual trial. We think this already materialized in countries like Rwanda through the Gashasha courts, and it was able to work because the TRC in Rwanda was able to take these individuals and take them to these particular areas where they were able to get tried and they were given the sentences that they got. We think that was more efficient and was beneficial. So what then do we tell you in terms of Clash Meta in this particular debate? We tell you that the major contention that we have in this debate is about whether or not it's important for us to have justice over truth. What do we tell you on their side, panel? We think justice is not as best as their claim on their side because one, majority of these offenders are people who are particularly influential in the legal space, meaning they are able to get the legal counsels that can be able to propel for their own defense mechanism. Then two parts happen here. Others already get acquitted and they go scot-free. Realize that out of the 195 people who were summoned to the ICTY, only 161 were indicted. What happened to the remaining over 30 people? We think these people were already let go, and at the end of the day, their impact was not there. But secondly, we even think that others will have long procedures leading to their death before even being able to serve their sentences. This particularly materializes in a very good example of a Serbian leader called Slobodan Milosevic. What did Slobodan Milosevic do? He was indicted by the ICTY, but he was only sentenced right after he had already died. So we think these long legal proceedings do not necessarily bring the justice that they try to argue on their side. But secondly, we think this justice is not all inclusive, right? Because these testimonies were never all inclusive to begin with. What does this look like? Leto and Dean already tell you about the physical and emotional distance that already existed between the Balkans and the ICTY. We've been also been able to stress on this particular channel panel. So we think obviously we already win in this particular clash. The comparative, however, then exists. We think on our side of the house, we allow for more transparency and allow for people to understand each other and resolve their differences and be able to understand each other. Secondly, we think local TRCs are able to allow victim healing and facilitation through national cooperation. We think what this looks like is what, as Dean tells you, we've got victim-centered solutions that allow for counseling, psychosocial support, and all things along those lines. We think these are particularly impactful because ultimately the rulings of the ICTY may never be sufficient enough to remove that generational trauma that people particularly experience. We think it's important that we also protect these victims because ultimately they're the ones who go back to society, and we think if we don't necessarily protect them, we have something that is going to be problematic. We think on our side, in their best case, we get justice for a few people, but on our side, we're able to ensure national healing and truth and reconciliation. What is then the last question in this debate? We think on our side of the house, we're able to get more justice and truth and reconciliation. How do we do this? One, we tell you that these ideas, these particular TRCs and their structures are locally based. Hence, we remove any issues of exclusivity which were perpetrated by the ICTY. But secondly, we think reconciliation gets better on our side because differences are resolved through transparency. Secondly, we facilitate recovery for post-generational trauma because ultimately we've got these all forms of mechanisms that allow us to support these individuals after they've been able to be subjected to this entire form of trauma, right? But in their best case scenario, where we actually get a world in which people actually get all these mechanisms that they try to argue about, we think they depend on people being able to put themselves forward to tell these testimonies. We think this is not likely going to materialize because people are afraid of persecution. But second, even if it does materialize, we think the distance that already existed between these particular regions made it very difficult for people to be able to give their own testimonies. And lastly, people already feel scared to tell the truth. And because people feel scared to tell the truth, we think think, one, we don't get anything in terms of victim closure, but secondly, we also have a situation where history gets misconstrued, meaning in the future, there's a likelihood of this happening again because people end up lying simply because they want a world in which they can get better sentences. So they don't necessarily tell us the entire truth and they hide other elements of this particular truth. We think that in itself then becomes problematic because if you're going to learn from anything about the Yugoslav wars is if we get the thorough and accurate analysis of everything that happened. We don't get that on their side because people are likely going to try by all means to ensure that they get better sentences on their side. For all these reasons and contentions, panel, proposition is proud. Thank you.
Right, thank the prop speaker, and I'll invite the opposition speaker to close this exam portion.
Proposition's main strategical mistake in this round is being very uncomparative on how their TRCs actually solve the issues that they attack about us. There are two main questions that I want to address. First of all, on victims, on which side do they get justice and which side do they feel that they have the retribution? And second of all, on international jurisprudence and why that is so important and not tackled by side proposition. Then on the first clash then, the first thing that proposition tells you is that the ICTY shuts out victims because it's based in The Hague. So maybe, yes, it is based in The Hague, but there were still local interviews of victims in Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. They also do investigation on site. The second thing they tell us is that on our side, we only prosecute 160 people. Note that I have three responses. First of all, it is not possible on either side to prosecute absolutely everyone. Second of all, the people that we did prosecute are high-ranking officials like Milosevic, like Radovan, and then we think that these are the people that actually orchestrated the war crimes and are most responsible for them. But third of all, from the victim's perspective, these are the people that victims actually want to see behind bars. Because sure, they probably don't know who is the soldier that went into the door and killed their family, but they have heard on the radio who is the person that orchestrated the war crimes. And this is the person that they hate the most and they want to see behind bars. Therefore, what we prove is that it is sufficient on our side to only prosecute 160 people, insofar as most victims actually feel like these people are the ones that are responsible. The next thing that they tell us is that the ICTY is biased, so victims view it as illegitimate. Now, we think that the ICTY is actually not biased factually, because factually more crimes were committed by the Serbs. But let's just, even if people feel that it is biased, we think that it is entirely symmetric on their side, because if the TRC is supposed to find out the truth, and that is the truth, then presumably Serbs will also feel like they're especially targeted on their side. So they have to pick one of two scenarios. Either their TRC finds out the truth and Serbs still feel horrible, or the TRC doesn't find out the truth and therefore they don't get any of their impacts on victims and on ethnic tensions. The third thing that they say is that victims can't defend themselves and go to courts in ICTY because they feel like it's a traumatic experience. There's two responses on why we flip this claim and that it is actually more traumatic on victims in TRCs. First of all, in TRCs, you give victims an equal platform with the war criminals. So it means that you have the same speaking time. You're in the same room and you have the same power. And note that this is a double victimization because you're put on the same pedestal as the war criminals. No, thank you. But while on our side, you are labeled as victim and the other person is labeled as defending and susceptible of a war crime. Therefore, we think it is actually empowering for victims to testify in ICTY because they are affirmed and they feel like they are directly contributing into putting these criminals behind bars. But second response then, what we think happens on their side in TRCs is when you have these talks between victims and war criminals, then war criminals gain an advantage because these are usually politicians who are very good at rhetoric, who are very good at riling people up and then muddling the truth. So what happens is they will likely claim their innocence on TRCs because we don't think these politicians are willing to admit that they did war crimes because when they wouldn't want their whole power rests on the fact that they have that their population thinks that they're innocent, So they will never admit that they actually commit a war crime. And so what we think will happen is that these politicians will try to muddle the waters and make it extremely unclear which side is actually guilty, because wars are messy and complicated. So what it means is that we think that victims are less able to actually get justice on their side, and that there's a double victimization, which we think does more harms than victims. Then I want to be very clear about the comparative here. Why we think victims cannot be advantaged on prop. Look, their model is that they're going to prosecute some like criminals and give amnesty to others. We give you several reasons in Frank's and Matthew's speech why TRCs cannot prosecute, because they have no judicial power, right? We said that they had less resources, they had less funding, while the ICTY had like $1 billion because of international involvement. These countries are fresh out of war. They have no like functioning judicial system. They have like no money to give to TRCs either. But note, and very importantly, is that they have no incentives to actually punish these criminals. Look, do you think like the Serbian courts would have an incentive to actually prosecute Milosevic when he was so influential that he probably put his own people into the court, that the public has a favorable opinion of them? So therefore we think that these populist politicians would likely not be able to be prosecuted on side proposition, and we think this is harmful for victims. And let me illustrate why it's harmful for victims. Because victims see these war criminals still roaming around, who are going to talk shows and claiming their innocence. These war criminals who are burning up Croatian flags in squares in Serbia. And so we think that therefore it is a horrible reminder of the crimes that these victims have already gone through. But notice also that if they get amnesty, notice that the optics of victims is that when someone gets amnesty, it's equivalent to the justice for giving them. And we think this is unacceptable for victims when their family has been murdered by these people. Now let me just quickly weigh this against their argument on ethnic tensions. We think that victims is the most concrete impact that we have in this debate. They've already suffered. They were unable to defend themselves. They're in a position of vulnerability. And we think that their claims on ethnic tensions are entirely speculative, while our claims on victims are concrete. Here are 3 points of weighing. First of all, ethnic tensions we think are too ingrained and can't be correctly solved on either side. It takes time for ethnic tensions to fade. Second of all, ethnic tension also arises when you put literally members of nations who hate each other together to solve an issue like they have in their model on TRC. Third of all, victims getting retribution we think is the prerequisite for having less ethnic tensions in the future. Before I go on, I'll take you on.
What is the exclusivity of prosecution on your side, since it already happens in top courts, which are only focusing on major?
No, we think prosecution is exclusive on our side, because I just gave you like 4 mechanisms on why your side is very unlikely to prosecute criminals, because lack of resources, lack of courts, and lack of judicial systems. On the second clash then on international jurisprudence, and note that there's a lack of engagement from side proposition. The only thing they say is that precedents already exist, ICC, ICJ. That is just factually incorrect, because these courts were actually based on the precedent of the ICTY and established others. There are 2 main benefits that Matthew brings to you of the ICTY. First of all, it recognized new crimes like rape that have never been acknowledged before, and that won't be acknowledged on prop, because TRCs can also only follow pre-existing precedents. It can't establish a new one. Note how important this is for the hundreds of millions of women who have been raped during war crimes and finally have their crimes acknowledged. And we think that this is that these vulnerable populations will have never had their crimes acknowledged before, and they need the ICTY to acknowledge and to actually typify rape as a crime. But second of all, it created new courts like the ICTR, Rwanda, that they talked about. That if we think on the comparative, that these courts would not have existed, because later on of ICTY, there's less involvement in international affairs, right? There's shift to the right, more focus on domestic policy. So the 1990s was the unique time that ICTY could be established. And I just want to weigh the impacts of this argument that we think consists in a unique path to victory, because we help victims around the world by establishing this precedent. There are infinitely many other future victims of war crimes that we are able to give retribution to, because we established the jurisprudence for future courts to exist. Never been prouder to oppose.
Right, and then Stephen to close the case for the opposition. I invite the reply speaker to take the floor.
Panel, Proposition 3 tries to frame this debate as a choice between justice and truth. Let me address that question before moving on to the key clashes of this debate, looking at who won those clashes, and addressing a comparative of what's left after both cases have been looked at. First of all, they try to characterize the justice that was made on the TRC as incomplete or bad by saying only 161 of 185 people were convicted. First of all, that seems like a significantly good ratio, but also there's 161 people, as we stated multiple times during our case, as we've explained, it has not been rebutted by side proposition, are the people who are the most important to be convicted and have a disproportionate impact for the victims, because those are the people that they see, those are people who have the heinous speech, those are people who led. Not only is it right for them to be convicted because they're the one who gave orders, but it's also the ones who have the most impact when they're convicted because those are people know and that people want to see behind bars. But also, we've shown throughout this case that even on the aspect of truth, which they try to frame as their big win, they cannot take the clash. Because, as stated during, during Opposition 1 speech, the ICTY started during the war. Therefore, a lot of crimes which would not be uncovered if the TRC started after the war, because a lot of crimes are erased during war times, could have been uncovered by ICTY. This is what Opposition 1 says in the beginning of their speech. It starts during the war, it has disproportionate impacts, it goes unanswered. But also, because contrary to what side proposition has tried to say, thousands of people testified in the trials here. The trials were televised and were watched by thousands in Yugoslavia, and thousands of people were convicted. But it's also because there's a crucial contradiction on side opposition about amnesty. They say that not everyone will be given amnesty, the most important criminals won't be given amnesty. We tell you that this contradicts their benefits because it's these individuals that are necessary to know the truth, because it's when these individuals that have committed the crimes and they can tell the truth, they have to choose whether they will convict these people or they will achieve truth. But even if we were to concede the entirety of proposition case on truth, we believe that it's still most important to achieve justice, because we've characterized throughout this debate the importance of how victims feel. We've shown it's the most important actors. This has gone unrebutted by side proposition. We say there's a complete disregard for the livelihoods and the feelings of the thousands and thousands and thousands of victims and their family, victims of heinous crimes, victims of rape, victims of death. The only rebuttals that come from side proposition are saying that, one, it is unfair. We rebut this by saying that people were tried on both sides, but also they took too long to convict people. First of all, most of the important criminals were convicted, but also TRCs take long. They gave the example of South Africa in the first speech. It took years and years for the TRC to uncover the entire truth without getting into justice. Finally, they tried to bring an argument about inclusion that is lacking on the ICTY without bringing positive material on their side, but let's still try to look at what was given on their case. First of all, they talk about distance. It's the most important argument, that it was in The Hague that people weren't involved in it. One, it was necessary for this distance, as we framed, because there couldn't have been, because of the war and ethnic tensions, there couldn't have been an ICTY in those countries. But also, as we said repeatedly throughout this debate, that has gone unanswered. Thousands of people testified. There were investigations on the ground. Thousands and thousands of people had their voices heard. They were obviously included in this. And finally, there is a clash that should have been a clash, but unfortunately goes mostly unresponded by side proposition about the international precedents. The only thing we hear is it's in Proposition 3 saying these precedents already exist. It doesn't really matter. First of all, we've explained in very much detail how the precedents were created by ICTY on the questions of rape, on the questions of sexual war crimes. They were created by the ICTY. This goes unrebutted. And so if they ignore this case, they disregard the livelihoods of the millions of rape victims throughout the world. If that is what proposition wants to do, we let them disregard it. And finally, let's look at the comparative of what's left on both sides. On our sides, we've explained throughout this debate how victims feel justice, how it is the most important thing. We've shown how they don't achieve substantial benefits on truth, and we've shown how we have an enormous impact on international precedent. It is clear why this panel should vote its ballot for side opposition.
Begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. When I arrived in Belgrade, towering over me was a bridge spray-painted with the words, "Serbia is Kosovo." For me, that message told me that the hearts of the Serbs are awash with terror,
pain and anger. It told me that the vitriol is still deep-seated. For proposition, where it's this emotionally tense, we choose to err on the side of lasting resolve. But a few strategic issues that we get from them. They strawman the ideas that we run on them. They engage a non-existent world where all criminals are unaccounted for on our side. We don't think this is true, particularly because our model looks like targeting foot soldiers with minimal charges so that they can get inside information and be able to repeat that. We told you this from setup, and we've told you this is substantively different from just persecuting generals, right? We thought that was something that was important. They tell us about lack of resources as a secondary rebuttal, but we don't think this is enough because we think things like jails are already existent and they don't do enough in terms of mechanizing that. On the one contention that we had split into two, we ask ourselves on who then does better for the victims. We look at it in the immediate justice and in the extended impact. On immediate justice, they tell us that, well, we trap top generals and you stop potential wars, and this is something. The problem with this is that they neuter their own contention by then admitting and telling us how these people are likely to then manipulate and lie and, be very rough to these TRCs, and this is something that kills them. We don't think that they can have these two examples of argumentation existing together. But secondly, they told us that, punishment gives closure, right? So we're going to tell you, we told you on opposition why then punishment is unlikely to even be accurate. One, we told you because people are likely going to be attempting to reduce their sentences, especially as generals, so are going to omit certain points of information and are likely not going to do that. But secondly, they told you that even if that wasn't the case, people don't even believe in that accuracy anyway, because people don't believe in the idea of the ICTY because of how it was exclusionary to the locals that were involved in themselves, right? But on our side, on immediate justice, we say that, well, the ICTY doesn't incriminate the right people because of the threat of incarceration and how people omit essential information. But secondly, we told you that the situation is generally too complex for them to just divide it up into perpetrators and victims. We told you that perpetrators are also victims, and it's such a complex situation in itself that we don't get why the ICTY would in itself be able to deal with this at a very large level. And then on extended impact, what is the pretext that we're going to give you here? There is a violent bitterness that sits at the heart of victims. On prop, we say it's important that we deal with this. One, because you get potential war happening as an adverse reaction, and the cooperation of economies in general, in the instance that we sever this type of thing. It's important that we cater to the extended impact, right? What do we provide when we do this? We tell you that reconciliation deals with this, and we give MECs for this setup. We tell you about reliable truth mechanisms, victim-centered remedies, etc. And we tell you about how we're going to use the remaining money for psychosocial support and things like that, right? On the way up now, we're going to ask ourselves, importantly, on the extended impact, why do we value this extended impact over immediate justice, even if they win on immediate justice? One, because people don't even believe in the immediate justice. We told you that because they don't believe in the immediate justice, we don't think that justice really carries it out in its full capacity to perform reconciliation. But secondly, we told you the extended harm is just likely worse because it's unlikely going to spew into further tensions and further political and potential wars in itself. And it's important that we then win, or we then address that particular issue in itself. We told you that it's very important in which we find a world in which we're able to find, to cater to the tension and the existing vitriol that is there. So we think, how then do we weigh specifically much better marginally from prop? One, we show you that the punishment on their side is not even accurate enough to provide the reconciliation. But two, we showed you that that punishment that they give in itself, even if it was, is likely going to be timely and likely is not going to deal with the situations of actually incriminating people. My P2 gives you analysis on why, at the end of the day, those particular people end up dying even before they get incarcerated. So we think it's important that you take our extended harm and how it's very important to this debate and you weigh this. In conclusion, Chair, we say that all struggle to bring perceived justice to a world that above anything else just wants to stop bleeding is an attempt that is much ado about nothing. Proud.